Welcome back to video 8 in this series, and in this one we're covering chapter 9, and that's where I introduced the model of the work. Now the reason why the model is introduced here, not the start of the work, is that the problem we have with political theory, political thought, is it's very disorganized. There's no order to it at all. Like if you went to political science, do a political science degree, or went to discuss political science, political theory in any way, you get given all of the political theories, and they're presented as all being on an equal footing. There's no narrative, there's no resolution anywhere, there's no clear hierarchy of who's more important, who isn't. Not like, say, for example, you'd have in physics. In physics, there's clear narrative as to how physics is developed. You go from Aristotelian to Newtonian, and then you go to Einstein through Maxwell, and there's a narrative, and you can see where each different thinker fits in this narrative, and you're not given Aristotle, Newton, and Einstein all at once, and then everybody acts as if they're all completely equal and acceptable in relation to modern physics, when that's clearly nonsense. But you have that situation in the political sciences, political theory. So that's why I began the work with the state of nature, because the state of nature concept is pretty much what underpins all of liberal theory. Once you understand that, then you can kind of disregard liberal theory on that basis, as we'll see in this chapter. And it's also why I went into Marxism, because that's the only derivative political theory which really we have in the modern era, even though it's of less importance and it's been kind of put to the wayside. So while doing this chapter, I won't go over all of the details in the chapter in the book, because that's obviously pointless. I'll just cover some additional details which aren't in the book and try to point out where I was thinking this could go to. Now, before I do that, I'll just outline the model anyway. The model is, and I'll also explain how this differs from Nemesis, the previous book, and from Juvenal to a point. In Nemesis, and Juvenal does this as well, he doesn't put it in these terms, but we have a center of the order, then we have intermediaries, and then a periphery. So what's understood as the center in that order is those institutions or people who make the decisions and do tend towards centralization within that order. So to give the example which I give in Nemesis, that would be kings. The king's court would be the center. And the intermediaries in this instance would be the nobility and the church in some periods of time. And the periphery would be the commoners. What happened in this book, in Themis, is that I've been going over this model quite a lot for a couple of years now, and what makes the most sense is if you stop looking at it in those terms and you look at it in a different terms, and you look at it as if the center cannot be occupied by a physical person, a real person, or a real institution that's physical. So in this new model, what we have is the center is always incorporeal, is not a person. It cannot be a person ever in the theoretical model. And instead you have upper intermediaries, lower intermediaries, and the periphery. Now this means that those actors that previously would have been considered the center are now upper intermediaries, and the intermediaries are now lower intermediaries. Now this might seem like hair splitting, but one of the reasons why this change has been done is because it becomes clear that if you try to understand different orders as if this center can be occupied and it can be a corporeal thing, you end up with lots of errors. You end up with lots of confusion and lots of a complete lack of clarity. But if you change them to upper intermediaries and always have the center as non-corporeal, then the model makes a great deal more sense, and a lot of things which previously were confusing suddenly come into clarity and stop being so confusing. One of the things which I think this model now makes clear is that during the modern period, with people like Hobbes, and this is something Juvenal pointed out as well, what's happened is that the idea that this center could be corporeal and could be a physical thing entered into political thought with people like Bodin and Hobbes. So what happens there then is that you end up with a lot of contradictions and incoherence, which then leads you into lots of confusion. So, for example, with Hobbes, he basically, as Juvenal pointed out, he made all law positive law. Now, there's a big problem with making all law positive law and with making the center a sovereign human being, because you end up with this problem of trying to explain as why they can be that sovereign and why they can be the creator of positive law, which is a question which has never been answered and nobody's come close to answering it. And when you go into the details of this, which legal positives have done, because they basically have a completely positive law focused approach, none of it makes any sense, and they can't even do the very basic thing of explaining who the sovereign is in any given order. And this is because there cannot be a sovereign in the Hobbesian sense in any given order. Instead, the best way to look at it is as is outlined in this model, and I'll try to explain why that is. But first of all, I want to point out the postulates of this model. So the first postulate is that all orders are of this shape. I'll show the picture on the board. Basically, all humans are centered around this. We all organize around an external center to ourselves, which makes it so that we can orientate in relation to other people. What we are not are solipsist individuals who are completely separate from everybody. Because if you operate from that basis that we're all solipsists, like the state of nature does and liberal theory in general does, then you have serious problems with trying to model orders, because the only way you can do that is to try to reduce your ordering mechanism to something extremely simple, which each actor within that order can be claimed to be operating in response to. So, for example, with Hobbes, you have fear. Everybody's scared of each other, and that's why they're all ordering around in a specific ways. And with you also kind of have this with like Adam Smith in economics, where they just say, oh, everybody operates in accordance with self-interest, without ever being able to explain that self-interest or anything like that. It's just left just there as, oh, we just have self-interest and we operate according to that. But how? Why? Where? What? Can you explain that in any detail? And obviously they can't. Now, the second postulate of this model is that humans are biological individuals. They're biological things. And they're constrained by language, tradition, and they're also constrained by the bounding of structural relationships, which is dictated by the model which you can see in postulate number 1. Now this is a point which liberalism it has no response to, because liberalism doesn't really treat us as biological limited people. It treats us as like these sort of godlike creatures who, again, we get our individuality from within us, and we're kind of like magical in that sense. There's no real limitation to what the individual is in liberal theories. So what this really means is that by approaching humans from as being tradition inhabiting entities who operate through language and are bound by their environment with their immediate environment in relation to this juvenilium. In the book we call it a tradition language model, so I'll start calling it that from now on. So within this tradition language model, we're able to actually put constraints on the human actor in such a way that it may possibly be we might be able to mathematize this model and actually formulate it in more strict senses than has been previously we've been previously capable of being able to do. So to see what that means, consider what humans are and how they exist. Okay, now humans, we have limited lifespans, so we live from anywhere to death at birth to maybe 80, possibly 90, maybe 100 years in some instances. But even if we live that long, the period in which we have the conscious ability to actually make any real effect on the world or understand the world might not be that great. So you could probably tailor that to maybe 50, 60 years in which we actually have a real engagement with the world. Outside of that, we become kind of dependents to a large degree. So we have limited lifespans. So we can't learn everything. We can't experience everything. We can't understand everything. We have to understand specific things at specific times because that's where we are. We're kind of thrown into the world at specific points. Which brings me to the second point. We come into existence in specific geographical locations. So, for example, I came into existence in the UK in the late 20th century. Other people would have come into existence in India at the same time, or Japan at the same time, or the USA at the same time. And those people would have experienced or would have been taught different things than I did at those particular times. And they would have understood the world through different concepts and categories as I did at that particular time. And this is the same throughout the entirety of human history. How we understand the world is dictated by the world in which we are born into and the categories which we are taught into. And then this brings us to the next point, which is that we exist within specific language systems. Now, what I mean by this is these language systems in themselves encode the concepts and categories by which we understand the world. Now, this is a problem which modern people seem to have in that they tend to understand that each language is completely translatable into other languages. So it's just a matter of clarifying which word is being used by which language and then just cross-referencing them. When actually there are many concepts which are not translatable in any easy sense. This is not to say that we can't understand the concepts in those different languages, or again, I'm not entirely sure what the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is claiming, but the idea, I'm not saying here that we can't understand things if we don't have the words for those things, because there is always the capability to understand that thing if we have enough additional explanation. We might not be able to put it within a single word or a couple of words as that language might be able to do, but we would be able to understand it by kind of using our language to kind of create an approximation of what that other language is claiming. The example I used in the book for this is the concept of religion, because the concept of religion has actually changed quite a lot over the centuries, and I think almost everybody would not be aware of how these different changes have occurred, but we can still understand what it probably meant in previous periods if we have additional explanation to cover that. Even though the specific word does not translate across those time periods. If we use the word religion to say Thomas Aquinas, he would and used our understanding of religion while talking to him, and he was using his understanding of religion while talking to us, we'd be in a state of utter confusion because we're using the same word, but they have completely different meanings because they're both predicated on a web of concepts and web of understandings of the world around us which are completely alien to each other. For example, in our modern period, the idea of religion is something completely internal, of choice, completely separate from a secular realm. But if you go back far enough in European history, this idea of this secular-religious divide just disappears. It just does not happen. If you try to explain it to somebody from that period, they would look at you with utter confusion and would not have the slightest idea what you were talking about. And this concept of religion has changed many times. I'll provide a graph on here so you can see what I mean. And this is the same with all concepts within any language. There's always going to be a giant web of additional concepts and understandings which you would need to understand for that concept to make sense to you in that way. And again, this is not to say we can't understand those concepts in another language, but we'd have to create like a model of the language in that other world so we can understand it through our language. And this creates a lot of a lot of conceptual confusion, and this is one of the reasons why retrojection has been such a major issue. And that's something we'll go over again in later chapters, so I won't keep banging on about that at this point. And instead, I want to go into something else with this model at this point. And what I want to go over is the issue of patrons. Now, in the previous chapter, when I was criticizing Marxism, I was making the point that the base superstructure interaction was never explained in Marxism because it wasn't. And one of the ways I think you could explain it is by focusing on the fact of patrons and the fact of traditions bounding the ways in which people can conceptualize and understand the world. Because once you do this, and you can see that patrons are actually funding specific tradition variants, which give the grounds from which subsequent people are thinking from, then you do have a mechanism by which this base can influence the superstructure. But that's not something you can get to within Marxism, because Marxism still retains the agent-based model of liberalism, in that they're still seeing these individuals as being kind of isolated, separate, subsistic entities. Whereas if you operate this through this tradition language model, these individuals are not that and have never been that, because they always operate through a tradition, they operate through a language, and the language itself encodes those traditions. This is something which I think Wittgenstein would have gotten. So what this means is that each language has its own store of concepts, its own history, its own recording of the conflicts and the directions which those people have taken. So what that means is that if you can control the traditions, you can control which variants of which traditions are taught and exist and are kept alive, then you can direct what the Marxists would call superstructure without too much effort. And if you look at the way that, for example, American foundations have operated in the 20th and 21st century, that's pretty much what they've done. They've been very careful to fund specific thinkers and defund other thinkers who would oppose them, so that only specific traditions have carried forward. Now, when you have people who are human beings and they are born into specific periods of time, so let's say, for example, we have an individual who's born in 1970, and they go through education, and by the time they're 16 in 1986, they enter university. Now, at that point, the university which they enter, the people who are teaching at university have been funded and been taught themselves via the American or whoever's the patron at that time has funded that realm, that seam of thought. So say, for example, we stick with political theory. Now, the Americans completely dominated political science by 1940s, 1950s with behavioralism. So if you were that individual, you were born and then you entered education in 1986 and started studying political science, you would have studied behavioralism in that sense. So how aware would that person be that Ford Foundation had funded all of these behavioralist ideas and completely defunded and refused to fund anybody else, completely dominated the market in that sense and just made that tradition as the dominant tradition? How would you know that that would have happened? You just would not have. And so you would have entered university and you would have been completely trusting of your educational, the people giving you the education and the whole system. And you go there and you listen to the lecture, you take your notes, you pass your exam, you graduate, go into politics, go into whatever. You've been taught that. You would have had no idea of how that came to be and what the situation is. You would have taken that for granted as it is at that point in time. And that's how humans operate. So you could control the superstructure in the Marxist sense perfectly well by doing that. And that's what has happened. It's on record. But was this done as part of some class sort of organization? No, it wasn't. The Ford Foundation report was definitely done by what would be termed in general parlance the deep state of America, because Ron Gaither, if you look at his CV and look at what he was doing, he wasn't operating as a capitalist. He was operating as a national security actor. So that's where the imperatives are coming from in this instance. To put it in terms of the model, he was within the upper intermediaries of the American system, and he was patronizing specific traditions of thought which supported his upper intermediary position within that situation, and the lower intermediaries were not able to fund alternative traditions and other alternative traditions which didn't accord with what Rome gave and Ford Foundation and the upper intermediaries of America wanted, just didn't receive any funding. And that's how the Marxist just called superstructure operates. It operates upon a basis of funding. Because without this funding, you don't have institutions. Without these institutions, you don't have educators. Without educators and people being able to continually discuss and pass on these traditions to others, then these things just wither away and disappear. And that's how things work. We don't operate on this anarchistic, like spontaneous system with ideas just sort of float in the air and move around, and then it just doesn't operate like that. It operates based upon institutions which are patronized by patrons, and that's how it all organizes. I've covered all of this in some detail in a chapter in the book, so I won't continue on this on the video. Instead, I want to move on to something else which I didn't cover in much detail in the book because it's not particularly clear, and I haven't been able to find anybody who would be of any help on this regard. I did reach out to some people, but I didn't get a response. One of the only responses I did get was just to put it through to ChatGPT, which is what I did. And this is the question of how reasonable and how possible it would be to mathematize this model and actually make it very, very formal. And ChatGPT gave me a number of recommendations, which on the surface, they look kind of reasonable, but I'm not an expert in those fields, so I don't know whether the AI is giving me nonsense output. So I'll cover some of it here, and maybe some people who are more familiar with these areas would be able to actually give me some insight as to whether this actually makes some sense. So the first one is going to be this, and I'll put some images on the screen as well while I'm talking. But it does look like you could approach this model using game theory by, both a two-party game theory and a three-party game theory, by approaching the upper intermediaries and lower intermediaries as being two parties within that game. This makes some sense because if you look at older orders, and Graeber was onto this as well. He was really onto this. It's a shame he died, because if you look at the upper intermediaries and lower intermediaries of older orders, like primitive orders, what they're always doing is they're always engaging in this kind of conflict to ensure that the upper intermediaries don't break away. So they're always keeping them under control, and we can see this in the division between divine kingship and sacral kingship. Now, if these lower intermediaries are able to keep this as a two-party game, then they're able to keep a lid on the centralization which occurs. However, if you have a situation where technology is introduced or some sort of means is introduced by which the upper intermediaries are actually able to engage directly with the periphery, then this turns into a three-party game theory. And I got ChatGPT to run some Monte Carlo simulations based upon this, using the model in the book and the logic implied in the book. And it gave me these graphs. And I say on the surface of it looks reasonable. But again, I don't know whether ChatGPT is hallucinating in this instance. So again, that's something which hopefully someone with more experience in this side of the area would know. Because, again, this is not my wheelhouse, so I don't really know at this point. And there are some other points as well where it gave me quite a detailed roadmap for quantification of this model, using a number of different possible tools which are available in statistics and just modeling in general. So I'll go over a couple of them, and again, if anybody with more experience in that area or understands that area has a way to sort of clarify any of this or tell me if the AI is just talking nonsense, then that would be very helpful. So the first one would be using PCA principal component analysis to identify dominant axes of variation in obligation-related language. Now, I understand what he's claiming here, because what you have to do with these models is you can't use specific definitions of who is where in a given model. So, I mean, for example, if you specifically said that kings always have to be upper intermediaries, then you've kind of shot yourself in the foot, because in other periods they're not. They definitely have been pushed down into lower intermediary roles. But if you use the PCA analysis to look at the literature in that particular order to see where the obligations and obligation languages in that literature is sort of centralizing, you can find out which node is which node in that particular order without forcing your model onto it. You actually let the data tell you what's actually happening there. And I asked ChatGPT to also model the British order at present using the model of the book. And I'll put that on the board because I think it actually got it down very accurately using the model of the book. Now, if you did that with PCA analysis, it would probably be a lot more robust, and you'd be able to track the way that different institutions are moving around at different times along those different orders. And I think that's something you could probably do with older orders quite well. I mean, there's actually a paper where they follow a sort of similar kind of process to this, if you want to call it that. I think it's a Stanford paper where I think it's called The Mirror of Princes, where they're tracing the way in which different books relating to the Mirror of Princes genre have changed the way that they're focusing who they're referring to and how they're referring to ordering of those orders. And they're using a similar kind of process. So that's, I think, a lot more sophisticated route along that way would probably work. But again, as I've said repeatedly, I'm not an expert in this area, so I'm not sure how specifically that could work. Or even if we were going to do that, that'd be actually quite a project, because you'd have to identify the literature you need to feed into the language model, and then you'd have to train the language model to understand what specifically you're looking for in those particular orders. And that would be quite an effort, because you'd have to get hold of all of the documentation. That would definitely be a team's worth of effort, and it'd take quite a bit of time. But I think it's feasible. It just, on the surface, it seems feasible. And then the next one it gives me is the Monte Carlo simulations, which again would have been in relation to the two-party, three-party game theory model, which I think does work. I mean, again, on the surface, it seems logical, because you are in a situation where you've got this two-party and three-party dynamic occurring, and then given it did that, and it managed to show me that when it turns into a three-party theory, it tends to go towards a large centralization. That tracks with reality, because it's when you get the technologies like writing and technologies like money, coinage especially, and other technologies which facilitate the ability of upper intermediaries to communicate directly with peripheries, that's when you start to get centralization occurring. So again, it kind of passes the sniff test, but again, I can't be entirely sure on that one. And the next thing it gives me is Markov chains. Now, this one I'm not entirely sure, because what's happening here is that the AI is definitely seeing that we have to model traditions phylogenetically. You have to put them in this tree. Now, it's trying to it's saying you can use Markov chains in that instance, but Markov chains don't have any, they don't retain history. I believe they operate independently of previous Markov chains. Whereas if you look at tradition within this model and the way it is approached through McIntyre, these traditions are kind of not entirely path dependent, but they're very path dependent, because they can only go in directions which the previous iteration has kind of laid out for them. Now, with humans, we are capable of understanding that we can think very differently to what came before us, but that's only if we're fully aware of this. So you have this, or the Oedipus mechanism, I guess. I'm not sure. The AI seems to be seems to be quite confident that you could deal with this statistically, but I don't know. Again, that's something for anybody who's more familiar with this sort of situation would be able to maybe give me some advice on. But all of this is as the AI model points out, is very Bayesian. It works on inference to a large degree. So we're using probability and Bayesian inference to try and establish where things are going, what direction they're going, how they're going that way, what's the likelihood that they'll go that way. And we're also bringing in the possibility of shocks coming from other orders. Because one of the problems with this model, well, it's not really a problem, but it's very easy to just isolate a particular order and forget that there are other orders which are influencing each other. So again, AI's noticed that, and they've introduced a co-evolutionary model where you can factor in shocks which are coming from different orders. And a good example I like to give of this would be like Europe during the revolutionary period. If you operated this model and maybe did a mathematized model of European orders at that time, you could probably track the different centralization levels of these different orders, and then you could input the shock of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic mass centralization of orders onto these other orders to see how that affects their traditions and how it directed their traditions and how resistant their traditions were to these changes which were needed as a result of the French centralization and the massive success of the Grand Army. Now, I've tried inputting that into ChatGPT, and it's given me some responses which do make a lot of sense, showing that some orders were very resistant to it, some were more capable of dealing with that problem. But that would be, again, you'd need quite a big co-evolutionary model to actually look at the way that these different orders interact. There's also, because it's not just the upper intermediates and lower intermediates that are interacting with each other in the periphery. You've also got upper intermediates from other orders who would have been interacting with the lower intermediaries of other orders. And you get this cross-pollination of ideas, traditions. So sometimes traditions can take big changes because traditions have developed in other orders which have suddenly developed ways in which centralization can be conducted more effectively than in those other orders, which creates a geopolitical conflict situation. Which Juvenal points this out, and it's one of the things which I think is correct, is that centralization follows the geopolitical position. The reason why you have so many revolutions on certain points is because these different orders are making moves to centralize and making moves to increase taxation because that's what other orders have done. So they have to match and they have to keep up with those other orders. So we can't see this model as operating completely internally, which is another thing which Marxists and liberals have done repeatedly, which we'll cover in the next chapter when we get to revolutions, because they always model these orders being completely isolated and separate, which doesn't track with reality at all. Now, one of the benefits of this approach and using this tradition approach and also putting people within the tradition so you can bound what they're thinking, how they're thinking, and the way that these thoughts can possibly change within this phylogenetic model, which has some path dependency, is that it gives you some possible areas in which you can employ statistical methodology, which is something which Marxism and liberalism, again, can't do, because they always have the individual as this black box, which doesn't have any real binding upon them. The closest you got would be Marx and his binding by the base of production, which still doesn't give you ability to make any mathematical models. But the thing is, if you look at like etymology, we can actually trace the way in which the words change statistically, and that should be the same with traditions. We should be able to possibly apply sort of statistical values to the ability of a tradition to drift in certain ways, and the probability of different traditions making large changes in response to shocks in other orders around them in accordance with geopolitical necessity. So this is a way which you could bind how you're interpreting these orders and how you're understanding these orders within statistical models, and it gives you lots of ways in which you can actually track it. I think what ChatGPT is telling me is probably very possible. But again, I'm not an expert in this area, so I did reach out to some people to see if I could find someone who would be able to give some advice on this, but I was unsuccessful. I've been unsuccessful so far. But this would be a mammoth project, because there's no way of knowing beforehand what would work and what necessary changes might be needed while you're going through this process, because I don't know how you'd be able to establish what statistical values you'd be able to apply to different tradition drifts or different traditions and how the shocks would occur. I think that's something you'd have to play around with, and you'd have to use it in relation to historical events to see if it actually tracked. So that would be, again, it would be a huge project. So it's not something I can actually say it, make any real comment on at the moment. This is what ChatGPT has given me, and again, it does seem like it's fairly reasonable. I mean, once you accept that people operate through traditions, there should be a way to model those traditions in that way, and we can see through history that that's what's happened. So I'm not sure. It should be possible, but again, it'd be a huge project, probably need lots of funding, and you need people who are very, very proficient in these areas, because again, I've put it through AI, but AI, I can't check whether the AI is just hallucinating or just pumping out gibberish to me, so I'm not too sure at this time. Who knows where we could go with AI or large language models if we could access it and actually train it within this model and see what we could actually model historically and at present to see what comes up. Because again, we could do this with other orders. We could do it with the Iranian order, with the American order, French, with all of them. And we can see if it actually reveals stuff which we might not have previously seen, which is the mark of whether a model actually works or not. So I think in the future, that would be the direction that this would need to be taken. We'd have to try and train it through language models, and we'd have to have people who are familiar with these more robust statistical means of modeling such things. But at the moment, I'm unable to do that due to funding, lack of expertise, and lack of time, really. But who knows, in the future, those sorts of things might resolve themselves. We might be able to actually try and do that. Because, again, if you look at the Stanford paper, which was doing it through the Mirror of Princes, which is very, very limited demonstration of how this could go. If you look at a model of this book and the ways we've managed to constrain the traditions and be able to constrain the way that people are acting so that we could model it and we could trace these things through the past, the potential is enormous. I mean, there's also other parts of the model which I think could be added to, which, again, I didn't include in the book, including the financial aspects, such as the bond markets and the and return on investment of energy, which could be factored into this, which I've tried to do with AI, and it's come back with some very helpful suggestions and been able to model things which, again, pass the sniff test, but these are things which I think would need a lot of people working on it and a lot of further discussion, testing, practicing, and a lot of refinement. Because, again, there might be a number of different things which will pop up which I haven't realized so far, and that's going to be a long-term project. But, again, that would depend upon finding people with the expertise in these sorts of area willing to work on it and who understand the model and the parameters of the model, as well as financial funding and time to be able to do it, which, again, it's not forthcoming at the moment, but who knows, maybe in the future. But with that, I'll leave this discussion here, and again, I'll leave my email in the description in case anybody wants to see what ChatGPT pumped out to me to maybe see if they could give some advice on whether it makes sense, whether it's hallucinating or what. So yeah, I'll leave it at that now.